So we are going to start naming our vessels. We're going to start with arteries and then we'll go into veins. When you're studying these, it's best to follow along with the lab as well because the lab gives you nice, organized lists of every single vessel that you'll need to know, and they're going to be the same ones that you'll need to know for lecture. Okay, so the lab in lab 10, it kind of organizes it by the regions, and I'm going to try and do the same. All right. But I am going to start with arteries first, and then we'll go into veins, right? Before we do that, let's just kind of talk about this image that I have up here. This is an incomplete image. While it is accurate in what it is labeling, it is not labeling everything that you guys need to know. All right. There are a few things that are just kind of unlabeled that kind of bother me about this image, but I think it's a good baseline. All right. And that's why I still included it. All right. Before we dive into the specifics of arteries and getting into some regions, we're going to start with the arteries of the head and the neck. But before we talk about that, we of course have to talk about the major branches, the major vessels coming off of the aorta. Okay, so we can see it in this image. We can see that there are 3 branches coming off of the aorta. All right, and remember that blood is being pumped away from the heart here. And so it's really important to identify these structures coming off the aorta so that we can identify again how blood is flowing to the limbs and trunk and whatnot. Okay, now I'm going to draw it out because it's just a little too small for me here. Okay, so here we go. Wow, it's beautiful. All right, cool. Yeah. That's stunning work right there, honestly. Okay, so here we have the aorta. We have the ascending aorta, the aortic arch. Cool. And then we have the descending aorta. The descending aorta is kind of going to be like tucked behind the trachea a little bit. And you'll see that a little bit in the next image as well. So we can't remember these labels, right? Because if I'm asking to trace blood from the ascending aorta and I'm asking you to show how it gets to the medial side of the forearm, right? You need to be able to talk to me and tell me every single structure that blood is going to pass through. And so if I'm starting at the ascending aorta, you need to tell me about the arch. You need to tell me about, well, it wouldn't be the descending, but you need to tell me the specifics, okay? All right, so let's talk about these 3 branches. So the arteries coming off here, one of them supplies the right side, and 2 of them go to the left side. Okay, cool. Okay, so let's start with the one that supplies the right side. Okay, so this is the first vessel coming off. This is called the brachiocephalic artery, or we could call it the brachiocephalic trunk. Okay, there is only one of these, right? So the veins will actually have a right and a left brachiocephalic, whereas the arteries, there's only one. Okay, and we don't put a right or a left on it. Okay, so I'm just gonna put B, brachiocephalic. Cool. Brachiocephalic artery, and then the the middle vessel coming off here, that is the left, we got to say left, right? Left common carotid artery. C. Okay, left common carotid artery. And then we have over here the left subclavian artery. Okay, if it's supplying the left side of the body, you've got to say left because a lot of these vessels are going to be paired. So I need to know which side of the body you are referring to. I need to know that you know. Okay, now this middle vessel here, the left common carotid artery, right? When you see the word common, it's really an indication that that vessel is going to split into other vessels that are similarly named. Okay, we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, So these are our left side, right? These two, those are supplying the left side of the neck. The brachiocephalic artery is going to supply the right side of the neck. Now, the brachiocephalic artery is going to branch into two different regions. Okay, so the first branch that comes off the brachiocephalic is going to be the right common carotid artery. All right, any guesses as to what the second one is going to be called? It's the right subclavian. Right? So these are the left common carotid and the left subclavian, whereas over here, the brachiocephalic trunk or the brachiocephalic artery branches into the right subclavian and the right common carotid. Okay, so this brachiocephalic is unpaired. Awesome. Really messy drawing, realizing I could have just, I don't know, included an image, but hopefully that was, I don't know, something. It was something. Okay. So let's dive into the head and neck regions. Okay, so on this side of the body that we're viewing, this is all the right side. All right, so let me get my, I don't want to draw anymore. I don't think that's helpful. Okay, this is all the right side. So everything labeled over here should have an R in front of it or right in front of it. Okay, the R would just be representing right. And you can, of course, abbreviate that for me if you need to in lecture and lab. Okay. So here we can see the brachiocephalic, right? So we know that that's going to be supplying the right side of the head and neck region, okay? And so from there, we have that common carotid, that right common carotid artery, and we have that right subclavian artery, okay? Now, branching off of the right subclavian artery are something is a vessel called the vertebral artery, the right vertebral artery. So we can see that here. It's just unlabeled. Okay. Now, the subclavian artery is going to actually go on the posterior side, is going to go underneath kind of the clavicle, and then it extends into the upper arm and the upper limb and changes its name. Okay. So you'll see that a lot of these vessels will actually change their name as they pass through specific landmarks or after they start to branch. Okay, so supplying the neck, we have the brachiocephalic artery branching into the subclavian. We have this vertebral artery, right vertebral artery. There's also a left, okay? That right and left vertebral arteries, they are going to move through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae, and that'll supply the posterior region of the neck. All right. And then more anterior region of the neck is going to be supplied by that right and left common carotid artery. Now, because I said common carotid, that's going to signify that it's going to split eventually into similarly named arteries. So that common carotid will split into the internal carotid artery, which moves more posterior, and the external carotid artery, which will stay more anterior up by the hyoid bone. All right. All of these other arteries that are listed here, you do not need to know. All right. So again, keep your lab manual open with you and follow along within the regions. What's listed in the lab manual is what you need to know. Okay. So really just everything from external carotid artery down. Okay. So that's more so the neck. Let's talk about how blood supplies the brain. Now, the brain is going to really be supplied. You can kind of view it here. You can see that the brain is going to be supplied by the internal carotid artery. You can see it's going to come up here. The external is more so going to be supplying the face, right? But the internal carotid supplies the brain, as well as the vertebral arteries. Okay, so here's just another image, right? So we can see the internal carotid artery coming up and supplying the brain. Okay, internal carotid artery is going to be supplying more anterior side of the brain. Okay, and then the vertebral arteries, now labeled, and you can see them passing through the transverse foramina, right, of the cervical vertebrae, and you can see it goes up through the occipital bone, that bone marking for the foramen magnum, and then it comes to the posterior side of the brain. Okay, now following the vertebral arteries, they will actually fuse together and form the basilar artery. Okay, so the basilar artery is what's going to supply that anastomosis that we talked about, the circle of Willis, right? This is the only anastomosis that you need to be aware of, and it's going to be supplied by the vertebral arteries on the posterior side. They fuse together, and then it's truly supplied by the basilar artery. Okay, so we can see the basilar artery is going to come up and it's going to supply this circle. Okay, and what it circles and encircles, the circle of Willis is going to be kind of surrounding the pituitary gland and also the optic chiasm, where the two optic nerves kind of meet. Okay, so you can also see coming from the anterior side of the brain, these little guys here. Those are your internal carotid arteries, right? So they kind of come in and also feed into the circle of Willis. So again, an anastomosis is providing alternate routes, right? So in case something happens to any of these routes, blood will still get to the brain. Okay, there will always be a blood supply. Right, so even if, this artery is compromised, there's still going to be a route to get over here. All right. You do not need to know the specific arteries of the circle of Willis. You just need to know that the basilar artery feeds it, as well as the internal carotid arteries, and it's the vertebral arteries that fuse together to create the basilar. All right, so going back to the neck, we can see the vertebral coming off. The vertebral is a little bit more lateral compared to the common carotid branch off of the brachiocephalic trunk, right? Because then it's the subclavian, and so the subclavian, the vertebral is a branch off the subclavian. Okay, so it's a little bit more lateral, and it goes up, and you can see up here, kind of when it reaches the cerebellum. Well, yeah, kind of around the cerebellum. Then it would be considered the basilar artery. Okay. So let's go to the arteries of the arm or the upper limb, right? So we have the subclavian artery, the right subclavian. We're dealing with the right side of the body, okay? And we can see that branch coming from the brachiocephalic. We could picture it all here. We could see the, right vertebral artery coming up off of here maybe. And then we can see as it passes the posterior side of the clavicle, it actually changes names, okay? So again, arteries, the vessels will change names based on specific landmarks, right? So subclavian artery stops after it passes behind the clavicle, and then it becomes the axillary artery. And it's the axillary artery because it's in the axillary region, which is really just kind of your armpit. Okay. And so it's axillary, it's the axillary. And so right about here, it becomes the brachial artery. Okay. One of your muscles is going to be the landmark for where the axillary artery and the brachial artery begin and stop. I believe it's one of the teres. I think it's teres major is where, well, I'm not going to test you on that, but just so you're aware, there is a muscular landmark here that separates the axillary in the armpit and the brachial in the upper arm. Okay, now that brachial artery is going to branch. So we have branch and branch. And if it's branching and going to the lateral side, what is lateral? What is always lateral? Radial is always lateral. Radial, lateral, radial, lateral. So when it branches to the lateral side and feeds the lateral side of the forearm, it's the radial artery. When it branches medially, it's the ulnar artery. So it kind of follows along with the bones of the forearm. Okay, so you do not need to know anything in the palm, right? Because that's not in your lab manual, so don't need to worry about that or anything. But just understanding the branching from the brachial artery, right? And that's going to branch just about at the elbow. Okay. Yeah, so make sure that we can follow the pathway of blood, right? So if I'm starting at the, let's see, yeah, I'm starting at the ascending aorta and I need to follow, let's say, all of the vessels until I'm at the left medial portion of the forearm. What is it going to be passing through, right? So left medial portion, I'm going from ascending aorta all the way to the left ulnar artery. Okay, so I've got to talk about every single thing that is going to pass through, right? So it'd be the ascending to the aortic arch, to the left subclavian, right? To the left axillary, to the left brachial artery, and then finally to the left ulnar artery, right? So we need to map everything out. And here we have a nice little image helping us. Okay, so keeping everything kind of straightforward, following the left, looking at the right. Okay, again, you do not need to know anything in the palm or the fingers, digits, anything. Right at the radial and the ulnar is what you need to know too. Okay. From the subclavians, right, it's really just repeated. All you would do is just switch out the rights for the lefts. Okay, so you could fill that in yourself if you'd like to, if that, makes it more complete for you to help you study. Now, something that's a little bit confusing with supply to the brain is that circle of Willis, right? Because in this map, it doesn't look like it did when we just showed that image, right? And that's because we're looking at it from a different point of view. Okay, so now instead of the posterior being inferior on our image, the posterior is now superior on our image. Okay, so remember those vertebral vessels, right? The left and the right, they are going to be supplying the posterior side of the brain, and then they fuse and become the basilar, right? And then they make the circle of Willis. The right internal and the left internal carotid arteries, they supply the more anterior portion of the circle of Willis. Okay, so they'll come in more anteriorly. All right, so it's just kind of readjusting how you're viewing it. Okay, but it's all pointing to the same thing. And again, you do not need to know the specifics of the circle of Willis, just basilar, the carotids, all that, and the vertebrals.